Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, trended yesterday on Twitter after pleading guilty to drunk driving. Many people have scrutinized how this case was handled to see if he received any preferential treatment, and I think that scrutiny is understandable. No one here needs to be reminded that we live in a world in which the rich and powerful get to play by very different rules than everyone else. Now, it seems like Pelosi's case was treated normally. He faces prison time. Even an expert brought on by Fox News, a station hardly sympathetic to the Pelosis, agreed that there is no evidence here of special treatment. But while everyone was focused on the Paul Pelosi drunk driving case, the real Pelosi corruption story was not in the West Coast vineyards where he was arrested, but back east in the swamp. You see, multimillionaire Paul Pelosi benefited from one of the $12 million Paycheck Protection Program loans that were issued in 2021, and he won't be paying back a dime. Pelosi owns an 8% share in a restaurant-based company called EDI, which will not have to repay two loans worth a total of $1.7 million. Both loans were completely forgiven, along with loans taken out by such notable small business owners as Khloe Kardashian, Tom Brady, and Reese Witherspoon. And that's not all. 25 loans valued at $4 million went to businesses and properties owned and rented out by the Trump Organization and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And even though PPP money was supposed to go to making sure people were able to keep their jobs through the COVID lockdowns, 15 of the Trump-related properties that received loans said they retained one job at most. And that's if they reported job numbers at all. Meanwhile, most small business owners saw little to no benefit. 1% of PPP borrowers got over 1/4 of the loan money, and only 25% of PPP funds went to workers that would have lost their jobs. The rest went to business owners, shareholders, creditors, and the like. Now, if you're wondering, when we as a political community debated the standards for PPP forgiveness, how companies should have to prove they use their PPP to actually retain workers, and whether PPP should be means tested to keep people like billionaires Jay-Z and Kanye from benefiting, the answer is we never did. As is often the case with policies intended to bail out the reckless elites that exacerbated the supply chain crisis by moving jobs overseas for cheap labor, or who caused the housing crisis by gambling with our mortgages, there was no public conversation about their fiscal responsibility. No, the only time elites have a problem with bailouts are when it's time to bail out ordinary Americans. I know most of you haven't forgotten the cruelty of 2008, when under the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, banks largely ignored the authority they were granted to extend loans to help families stay in their homes. Meanwhile, AIG was bailed out with multiple lines of credit totaling about $182 billion. Did we learn from this mistake? No. In response to the corona pandemic shutdowns, $500 billion of taxpayer money went to bail out corporations. Elites helped their own in 2008, and they're doing the same thing now. It's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. Pelosi is as culpable as Kushner. In fact, back in 2008, both the Trump family and the Pelosi family were Democrats. It was never about left-right, but top-down. It's a big club, and you're not in it. Given this backdrop of enormous bailouts for the rich, implemented with little to no public debate, the conversation around student debt cancellation raises some huge red flags. I want to start by saying this. By no means is student debt the most corrosive form of debt. I can imagine any number of other debtors who are caught up in situations much more dire, who comprise a poorer, less advantaged class, and who need a bailout more. But we're talking about student debt right now for two reasons. One is that, unlike other kinds of debt relief or anti-poverty measures, Joe Biden has the power to cancel student debt without difficult-to-get congressional support. Because most of the student debt is federally held, the result of a policy intended to encourage Americans to go to college, Biden can, by executive order, cancel the debt by simply not demanding repayment. It's the same mechanism that Trump used to begin the student loan pause that's been ongoing since the early days of the COVID pandemic, and which has been saving the average American borrower from paying about $300 extra a month in student loans. The other reason we're talking about student debt right now is because Joe Biden ran on a promise of canceling at least $10,000 of student debt for everyone making under $125,000 a year, and to cancel all the student debt for graduates of historically black colleges and universities. I want to be very clear that student debt cancellation isn't some unreasonable left-wing demand that I'm bringing up. While I support Bernie's plan for full cancellation, the conversation happening right now is about holding Biden accountable to his campaign promises, whether you agree with them or not. Now, all that being established, I have to ask, does the elite pundit response to student debt cancellation strike you as, well, out of sync with its silence on the bailouts for the wealthy? Student debt cancellation is popular. Unsurprisingly, 64% of Americans support some cancellation. 44 million Americans have student debt. It has affected the economy in myriad negative ways, including lowering millennial childbirth rates and our willingness to enter the housing market. In 2016, over 100,000 seniors had their Social Security checks garnished to pay for student loans. But you wouldn't know how popular it is from listening to elite pundits, most of whom had parents who were rich enough to pay for their college out of pocket. Jason Furman, who went to Dalton, an elite New York private K-12 school, which cost nearly $60,000 a year, before he attended Harvard and the London School of Economics, he insists that student loan relief would be paid for unfairly by the masses. But student debt cancellation is not paid for by new tax revenue, and it's certainly not paid for by the poor. Just like the PPP loans for elites were canceled without fanfare, so could these loans to American students. The government will miss out on some profits in the form of interest payments made by these young people, interest payments that are often as high as 8%. But I happen to think that making students pay interest rates that are sometimes double the rates homeowners are asked to pay is a little perverse. Still, even if you disagree, you have to ask yourself, is Paul Pelosi more deserving of loan forgiveness than your child? Matt Yglesias, the founder of Fox Media, is another student debt cancellation detractor. In a recent tweet, he asked, what is the plan for the day after universal debt cancellation, when master's programs raise tuition and tell prospective students not to worry about it because debt will be canceled down the road? Well, that's a question easily answered. Student debt cancellation, as it's currently being conceived, does not implicate graduate school level debt. So the implication that the government would be on the hook for loans taken out for master's programs is incredibly misleading. But to the extent that there is a good faith concern that one-time cancellation won't solve the larger debt crisis, I agree. That's why I backed Bernie's plan to combine debt cancellation with a plan to fund free public colleges and universities. Instead of poo-pooing student loan cancellation, Matt could argue that Biden's plan doesn't go far enough. But he doesn't. And in doing so, Yglesias makes a strong case for why Harvard as an institution should go the way of the dinosaur. Instead of a federal loan program, public funds would be better spent on strong public institutions that can educate Americans for free. Yes, let's avoid federally backed loans that have contributed to higher and higher college costs. But Biden won't do that, and possibly can't pursue that given the composition of the Senate and lobbying efforts to maintain the status quo. So I put this to Yglesias. Wouldn't public funds be better spent on canceling student debt than on forgiving the more than $400,000 in PPP loans your employer, the Niss Cannon Center, received? When will Matt find the time to complain about that? Now, I really like this Yglesias tweet because it represents a broader trend. A lot of people are now proposing alternative solutions to the debt crisis, anything but canceling student debt, including a lot of stuff that I support. Andrew Yang even suggested canceling medical debt, a policy that I not only agree with, but one that I have supported consistently for years, and one, by the way, which cost only $81 billion before the pandemic. That's only about 2 Ukraine aid packages. What I want to know is, why are people only now backing all of these wonderful policy prescriptions? Is it in good faith? Or is it an effort to deflect from Biden's ability to actually give direct relief to debtors via executive order without the convenient obstacle of Congress? Running cover for Biden seems especially pernicious given his role in creating the student debt crisis. Because of a 2005 Republican bill backed by Joe Biden, student loan debtors were stripped of bankruptcy protections, causing the amount of student debt to triple as a consequence. As a 2019 Guardian article notes, it was a huge giveaway to lenders at the expense of indebted student borrowers, but it passed with the support of 18 Democrats, including Joe Biden. And this is unsurprising. Remember, Joe Biden was known as the senator from MBNA, the credit card servicing company now known as Bank of America. Biden's nickname pointed to the fact that as the senator from Delaware, he was one of, if not the most corporate-friendly, swamp-friendly senator in Congress. Politicians from Delaware make their political bones by pandering to the banks which headquarter there due to corporate-friendly tax policies. And that means siding with big banks, even when those banks' interests were against the interests of Biden's constituents. Because of Biden, if I buy $1 million house or a Lamborghini and cannot afford to pay, I can declare bankruptcy, as Donald Trump has done repeatedly following poor business decisions. But education debt, that will follow you until the day you die. And that's what all of this is about. Running cover for Joe Biden and the Wall Street swamp creatures he has always represented. Student loan servicers and banks profit handsomely from administering millions upon millions of student loans, and they spend millions lobbying to ensure that politicians like Biden let them suckle at the teat of American students. Biden was the top recipient of contributions from student loan companies, followed only by Donald Trump. We live in a world where lobbyists are literally writing legislation, but even worse, working people are being used to whitewash that effort. Many people in very elite media positions have argued, ironically enough, that it is elitist and unfair to working people to cancel student debt. They argue that poor people are somehow paying for it even though it costs nothing, and even though any revenues the government isn't able to collect by cruelly charging 18-year-olds 8% interest rates on education debt could easily be collected instead by implementing a billionaire's tax, a policy with strong bipartisan support, but which some faux populists seem to never remember to bring up. This was the gist of a recent Newsweek article. But I'm confused. Is it elitist to create a world where your ability to be a doctor or a teacher or an engineer or a nurse is based on your interest and your ability, not on whether mommy or daddy can write a check for you to go to school? If they are so committed to canceling debt, the Newsweek columnist writes, why not push for car loan forgiveness or medical debt forgiveness, which would help more classes of people? Progressives are not rallying for those causes, the author wrote, because it doesn't focus on highly educated elites. But, of course, progressives are focused on those things. Here's Bernie Sanders advocating for medical debt cancellation during the campaign. And here are AOC and Bernie advocating for credit card interest rates to be capped. And here's the Debt Collective, the organization that's been leading the push for debt cancellation, fighting for bail debt cancellation, tenant debt, and medical debt relief. In fact, the Debt Collective uses its limited resources to buy up debt for pennies on the dollar from servicing companies and pay it off. In the years after the Occupy movement, it used about $400,000 in donations to buy $13.5 million in medical debt for 2,700 debtors, along with $1.2 million of other personal debt, and they canceled it. Now, I hate to impute bad faith to people, but those of us who are sincerely invested in working class and poor people's movements know this. Bringing up other forms of debt cancellation now, at this time, is a pretty transparent attempt to deflect from the fact that Biden only has the executive authority to cancel one type of debt. I wish it weren't the case, but that's true. He can only cancel student debt right now. And running cover for the Biden administration and the big banks who pay him doesn't make you a working class hero. Hold the Springsteen tracks. Running cover for the senator from MBNA is the most elite of elite behavior, no matter how much you want to dress it up as a working class issue. The only question you have to ask yourself is this. A rich person and a poor person each have a child with great grades and an interest in being a doctor or a nurse or a teacher. Should the ability of the student and their interest drive whether they get to go to college or go on to medical school? Or should their parents' income determine that? Rich gatekeepers are paying millions of dollars to make sure America's students aren't bailed out, but Kanye, Kushner, and Paul Pelosi are. It's corruption, plain and simple. And with your help, it looks like elites are going to get away with it again.
Something to quibble with. I'm not sure that this policy is as popular as you're making it out to be. It matters how it's asked. Like, I just Googled it, and so 59% of Americans are worried student loan forgiveness will make inflation worse, for instance, which I wonder
why they think that, Robbie.
Because it probably will make inflation
All right,
worse.
so where was this conversation in these polls when the PPP loans were being forgiven without fanfare earlier this year?
Yeah, we shouldn't. I don't want to forgive any of those other things either. Look, I take your point on the bailouts. It's hypocritical. I agree with you on all that. All of these wealthy people seek bailouts and
get bailouts.
And they get them. So yes, I get that. Look, I feel badly for young people who took on this debt. It was a really bad idea.
Old people.
Nobody made them do it, though.
No, but Robbie,
you make an agreement.
That's not true, Robbie. The government, and you maybe are a little too young to remember this, but in the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, right up through Barack Obama, the rhetoric was clear. If you are poor, if you are from an underadvantaged community, if you are black, if you are brown, if you have low educational attainment, it's your fault. It's not the government's fault. You need to go to college. And here are federally backed loans for you to go to college and pull yourself up by your own bootstrap. That was the narrative from Republicans and Democrats alike.
It was bad policy and bad advice. Yeah.
And now they're stuck with them. Now you can say, it was your choice and you should have understood the bargain, but the President of the United States and everybody in elected office was telling you that this is absolutely the bargain that you should take. This is the ticket out of this situation. And because it's federally backed loans, I would argue that the government has a responsibility. Just like they apparently had a responsibility to cancel all of these PPP loans, which nobody cared about. So here's the thing. I agree with you. There are things that poll more strongly. There's kinds of debts that I would prefer to be canceled. But this rhetoric that you're getting out of this Newsweek op-ed that says it's unfair for working people because working people have to pay for it, that's just not true. And moreover, it ignores the fact that there are all these working people who would love to have the choice. If you don't want to go to college, nobody should have to go to college. And I'm fighting for a living wage for people who don't want to go to college. Look, unlike a lot of these people.
I will reconsider this policy if we get rid of the subsidized loans.
Wait a minute.
First.
I want that as well.
Yeah,
but the point of the matter is, I would love for Joe Biden to do that. He's not going to do that. That's his policy. Those are his plans. All of this distraction to these other policies, it's not that I disagree, but that there are better ways to go and better options here. But the reason that this is getting so much attention and why there is this paid corporate-backed attempt to detract from this particular policy is that unlike a $15 minimum wage or other things that are very popular, including in Republican places like Florida that passed a $15 minimum wage by ballot measure, Joe Biden can't hide behind a parliamentarian. He can't hide behind having very slim margins in the Senate. He can't hide behind any congressional wonkery to not actually do this. He has congressional authority, which we all know, because it's the exact same authority that's been used to keep Trump's moratorium in place. And if he decides to ever lift this moratorium, he will be showing to the world that he is willing to do less for the average American debtor than, frankly, Donald Trump is willing to do. And he's going to have to live with that decision before midterms or before a primary election.
In my view, you have to fix the terrible incentives that led to this place, which it sounds like you don't like those either.
I don't like those either.
We need such fundamental reform to look. I mean, I agree. The colleges are greedy bloodsuckers. What they've the go to college. That's the take on more debt. Stay another year. Go to graduate school. All that advice was bad. And look, I feel very badly for the people in those positions. But we can't just do it. From my perspective, we can't do this one-time kind of without changing any of the incentives because it'll pile up again. The next people coming along will have the exact same problem unless we fix that first.
Well, let me ask you this, Robbie. There is now a conversation happening about free public colleges and universities that literally wasn't happening at any point prior to this, including during the Democratic primary when Bernie Sanders was the only person talking in those terms. Now, suddenly, everyone from Andrew Yang to Matt Iglesias is like, oh, we got to do all this other stuff. And they are only saying that because they're so desperate to detract from student debt cancellation. So I would argue that the movement is doing exactly what it needs to do. It's putting pressure, because it's something that Biden can literally do in this moment and that he's getting a lot of heat for not doing. It's putting pressure on the broader movement to reform American education. I think that's a good thing, but we cannot let pressure off at this juncture or everyone's going to go back to their laurels. The cost of colleges are going to keep going up and no one's going to fix the system.
Well,
that's why everyone, even if this isn't your main priority, even if your broader goals are free public education broadly, you should be fighting for student debt cancellation. So because that's where the political lever is right now.
Congress should do something. There should be. We should take the frustration that many in the progressive camp have about the enormous debt that these students have, pair that with the frustration that many Republicans have about the kind of values coming out of higher education, the subsidies for the kind of people who hate our lifestyle, and come together and punish colleges for putting people in these debt traps by changing the federal loan subsidies and all that. That would be a great thing for bipartisan thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that from a speech perspective, we should be using dollars to try to coerce what happens in our institutions. If Republicans want to change institutions, they should become a part of them and change them from the inside, start their own institutions, and do things like that.
Well, they're subsidizing them. They're giving them all this money.
Well, our tax dollars are going toward many public goods. I don't know, are Republicans subsidizing streets going down, the West Village where all the gays in New York are? Is that like a problem too? Like, come on, at a certain point it gets
we always go
silly.
to the roads. When we go to Who Will Build the Roads, we know it's time to wrap the segment. All right.
Fair enough.
We'll have more Rising right after this.